All right, class, so here we are on Wednesday, February 3rd. We're going to finish up chapter 4 today on tissues, and then Monday, February 7th, will be your first lecture exam. And I posted some study tips in the announcement section to kind of give you a little bit of a study guide for questions that might be asked on the lecture exam. So for your lecture exam, you'll come to Zoom the same way. So here I just have the syllabus. So today we're in, so lab is still on schedule. So if you have lab today, we'll do exercise 5, and you will have a lab activity due. But this lecture exam, which was scheduled for today, we'll have on Monday on chapters 1 to 4, it's 100 points, but it's not 100 questions. And the study tips, again, are posted in the announcement section. I just put a bulleted list of questions that'll help you kind of guide your studying. And then, so that'll be, so just on Monday for a lecture, we'll only come and do a lecture exam. So we won't start another chapter on Monday. We'll just have the lecture exam. You have to show up in Zoom with your video on so that I can see your face and eyes lit up. And I won't send you the link until I see your face and eyes lit up. So just keep that in mind. You have to come to Zoom class on Monday with the video turned on. And then it'll be the same way. I'll send you a Google link, the way you do your lab activities. And that is how you'll take the lecture exam. It'll be all multiple choice or matching questions. And you'll see from the study tips I give you, you should be pretty well covered for most of the questions. So let's go ahead and finish up chapter 4. I want to make sure we have time to get through chapter 4 today. Chapter 4 again was on tissues. So tissues kind of take us through the remainder of chapter 4. We kind of finished, we're going to finish up epithelial tissue and then get through connective muscle and nervous tissue. So in epithelial tissues, we talk about cells having a free surface that is not in contact with other cells and faces away from underlying tissues. And the characteristics of the free surface will always reflect its functions. Sometimes the free surface can be very much smooth, or it can be lined with microvilli to help with absorption and increasing surface area, or cilia, where cilia will move materials on top of the cell, much like in your respiratory tract, cilia moves the junk trapped in the mucus out of your airways. And then microvilli, increased surface area, often found in the digestive tract. Cell connection. So in epithelial tissue, you have a lot of cells that are tightly connected together, and cells have different structures that hold one cell to another or hold them to the basement membrane. And these structures do 3 things. They mechanically bind the cells together. They help to form a permeability barrier, which allows some things to pass through the cells and other things cannot. And they also provide a mechanism for intercellular communication, so communication between cells. And desmosomes are the mechanical links that bind cells together. Hemidesmosomes are like half desmosomes that anchor cells to the basement membrane. A tight junction prevents the passage of materials between epithelial cells because they will completely surround the entire cell, similar to the way kind of a belt surrounds the waist. And materials that pass through epithelial cells must pass through the cells. So cells will regulate what can go through them. Tight junctions will especially be found in the lining of your intestines. Gap junctions are a specialized type of cell connection that are small channels that allow small molecules and ions to pass from one epithelial cell to an adjacent one. And most of your epithelial cells are connected to one another by gap junctions. And researchers have come to believe that molecules and ions moving through these gap junctions act as a communication signal to coordinate activities between those cells. So here's just kind of an artist's rendition of what these cell connections look like. Remember that hemidesmosomes connect the cells to the basement membrane. Desmosomes connect cell to cell. Adhesion belts and tight junctions really keep the cells nicely tight together. Some of these adhesion belts are made of different filaments, like actin filaments. And then here we see the gap junction, which is again like a channel, which allows things to pass through them, like ions, molecules. And these gap junctions allow for communication between cells. You'll find gap junctions are very important when we get to your cardiac muscle, so that all of your cardiac muscle cells contract at the same time, which is important in your heart. These gap junctions will help with that. Glands, we also kind of keep into this epithelial kind of type of cell. Gland is a secretory organ that secretes substances onto a surface of your skin, for example, into a cavity like your digestive tract, or into the bloodstream like a hormone from an endocrine gland. And glands are composed primarily of epithelial tissue with a supporting network below of connective tissue. Glands with ducts are called exocrine glands, and both the gland and its duct is lined with epithelial tissue. And endocrine glands do not have ducts, and they secrete their hormones directly into the bloodstream. Most exocrine glands are multicellular, meaning they're comprised of many cells. Some exocrine glands are composed of a single cell, like a goblet cell, which secretes that mucus that we talked a lot about in your respiratory tract. A multicellular exocrine gland can be classified according to the structure of their duct and the secretory region, where a simple gland has a single non-branched duct. Some have branched ducts. A compound exocrine gland has multiple branched ducts. Glands with a secretory region shaped as small tubes are called tubular, whereas those shaped in more of like a sac are called acinar or alveolar. Tubular glands can be straight or coiled, and glands can be a combination of the two, called tubuloacinar or tubuloalveolar. And I don't think there's many questions on your lecture exam about glands, but again, important to note that they're lined with epithelial cells. Here's a simple tubular gland like in your stomach and colon. The secretory portion is what will create the products that will be secreted into the duct. And here's a compound gland because you can see more than one secretory portion that again secretes all the substances it creates into the duct, and the duct then releases the substances usually into the body cavity, a surface. Okay, more exocrine glands can be classified in how their products leave the cell. Amerocrine secretion involves the release of secretory products by exocytosis, and apocrine secretion involves the release of a secretory product as kind of a fragment that's being pinched off of the gland cells. And holocrine secretion involves the shedding of entire cells. So this just describes how these exocrine glands actually get rid of the substances inside their cells. So here's the amerocrine gland, which secretes its products by exocytosis. So you'll see vesicles fusing with the wall and then kind of spitting out the secretory products into this duct. Apocrine gland has kind of a portion of the cell near the lumen contains secretory products that are pinched off. So pieces of the cell are pinched off to secrete the ducts. And then a holocrine gland, we actually kind of have parts of the cell being sloughed off as a dying cell as it releases the secretory products. So that kind of finishes our epithelial tissue talk. Now connective tissue, if you've all had lab on this, and you know by now that connective tissue is the most diverse primary tissue type. It differs from all the other tissue types in that it consists of cells, but they're separated from each other by a very abundant extracellular matrix. Connective tissue is very diverse in structure and function, and connective tissue will be comprised of cells, but also the protein fibers and the extracellular matrix that will surround those cells. So there's just a lot going on in connective tissue. Functions of connective tissue, it will enclose and separate other tissues. It will connect tissues to one another. It will support and move parts of the body like your bones. It will store compounds like your adipose tissue. It will help to cushion, insulate, transport blood, and protect. The specialized cells of the various types of connective tissue produce what we call the extracellular matrix, and the name of the cell will identify the cell function. So an osteoblast will build or form bone. Osteocytes are the mature bone cell that maintain bone. So osteocytes are mature and osteoclasts break it down. Fibroblasts are cells that form fibrous connective tissue, and fibrocytes are the mature cells that maintain it. Chondroblasts, chondro means cartilage, so they'll form cartilage, and chondrocytes are the mature cells that maintain the cartilage. These cells are found in connective tissue. Some are associated with the immune system, like white blood cells. We have macrophages. They ingest foreign substances. Mast cells, they do not move. They release chemicals like histamine that promote inflammation. So those are some of your immune system cells. And then the extracellular matrix is anything that is not cells in connective tissue. And the three major components of extracellular matrix are protein fibers, and each type of connective tissue will have different types of fibers, ground substance, and the fluid. The ground substance consists of non-fibrous protein, other molecules, and the structure of the matrix is responsible for the functional characteristics. So the ground substance, for example, of bones and cartilage helps them to bear weight. So each kind of connective tissue, even though they're made up of protein fibers, ground substances, and fluid, each will vary in what that looks like if we're talking about bone, cartilage, blood, adipose tissue, and so forth. There's three types of protein fibers. We have collagen, reticular, and elastic fibers to help form most connective tissues. Collagen fibers are the thickest, strongest. They look like ropes. They're flexible, but they resist stretching. Reticular fibers are much thinner, fine, shorter, and they form kind of a branching or supporting network. And then elastic fibers are the ones that can stretch, so they can return to their original shape after being stretched or compressed, which give the tissue kind of an elastic quality. The matrix ground substance then includes non-fibrous molecules and is shapeless. And again, this will differ based on what type of connective tissue we're talking about. It will consist of what we call proteoglycans, which are molecules that consist of a protein core attached to many long polysaccharides or simple, like a long line of sugars. What proteoglycans will do is they will trap large quantities of water, which allows them to return to their original shape when compressed or deformed. And the types of connective tissue, we can have connective tissue that forms in the womb, in the embryo, or in the adult. And by about 8 weeks of development, most of the embryonic connective tissue has become specialized into form the different types of connective tissue. Again, the many different types of connective tissue, because it's very diverse, as seen in adults. So we'll go through the different types of connective tissue now. We have loose connective tissue, consists of few fibers that form a lacy network, and it's just really filled up with a lot of ground substance and fluid. So loose connective tissue has sparse fibers. It's really filled with ground substance fluid. And the three types of loose connective tissue can be areolar, adipose, and reticular. Areolar primarily consists of collagen fibers and a few elastic fibers. The most common cells in loose connective tissue are always fibroblasts because they're the cells that help to create those fibers. Adipose tissue consists of adipocytes, which are fat cells, and they just contain fat or lipids in them for energy storage. And adipose tissue will pad and protect parts of your body, also acting as a thermal insulator. Reticular tissue forms the framework of lymphatic tissue, such as in your spleen and lymph nodes, as well as in the bone marrow and liver. And this is a look at loose areolar connective tissue. You can see kind of fibers throughout it, loosely scattered, but a lot of empty space that's filled with ground substance and fluid. Elastic fibers are much thinner, and then the collagen fibers are the more thicker rope-like fibers. And we'll see a lot of loose areolar connective tissue underneath the layers of the skin, kind of right below the dermis. We'll have this loose connective tissue, which will look like loose areolar, or it'll actually be adipose tissue as well. Adipose tissue has these large kind of adipocytes, which look empty, but they're filled with fat. And there's so much filled with fat that they push the nucleus off to the corner or the side. We'll see adipose tissue throughout kind of your skin as a thermal insulator, as well as parts of the renal pelvis, around the kidneys, and mammary glands. So that is adipose tissue. Then the dense connective tissue has a much larger number of protein fibers that form very thick bundles. And there's two kind of subcategories of dense connective tissue, collagenous or elastic. And the collagenous connective tissue is made of mostly collagen fibers. The collagenous connective tissue has an extracellular matrix of those collagen fibers, and dense regular connective tissue will have those collagen fibers oriented in the same direction, stacked on top of each other to make a really strong material that is found in tendons and ligaments, because we need those body structures to be very strong. Dense connective tissue made of collagen bundles can also be dense irregular, and this will be found in the dermis of the skin and in some organ capsules. Dense irregular just means those collagen fibers are oriented in multiple directions. So as shown here, this is a look at dense regular connective tissue. So it's dense. We have collagen fibers, but their fibers are all facing in one direction. So they're nicely stacked on top of each other, parallelly arranged. And you can see that this is what will make up tendons and ligaments. Dense elastic connective tissue has elastic fibers, and elastic fibers will allow the tissue to stretch and recoil. So we'll find it in your vocal cords. And one genetic condition called Marfan syndrome results from, in part, the inability to properly maintain and form elastic fibers. So that's dense elastic connective tissue. So here we have dense regular elastic tissue. You can see that the bundles of fibers are a little bit thinner than dense regular collagenous. So here we have elastic fibers. They're still arranged parallelly, but they just look a little bit thinner. We'll find elastic tissue in blood vessel walls, as well as in your vocal cords, because again, they can stretch and can recoil back to their kind of initial kind of shape. Okay, everyone still with me? We're just gonna kind of keep powering through here, going into cartilage. So again, big picture, we're looking at connective tissue and all the different diverse types of connective tissue. They're all made of cells and protein fibers and ground substance. And based on what the cell is, based on what the fibers are, and based on what the ground substance is, that's what gives the connective tissue the different diverse types. So cartilage is, first of all, composed of chondrocytes, which are those mature cartilage cells. Again, chondro, that prefix means cartilage. They are located in those spaces called the lacuna, which hold them within an extensive matrix. Collagen in the matrix gives cartilage flexibility and strength, and cartilage is very resilient because those proteoglycans that make it up trap water. Cartilage provides support, but if bent or slightly compressed, cartilage can always resume its original shape too. And these are the three types of cartilage that I briefly introduced in lab. We have hyaline cartilage. It's the most abundant. It has many functions, but it covers the ends of your bones where they form joints. So your bones aren't rubbing bone on bone. They have this layer of cartilage to kind of make it a smooth, frictionless rubbing between your bones at the joints. Fibrocartilage has more collagen than does hyaline cartilage, so it's able to withstand compression and resist tearing and pulling. So we'll see fibrocartilage in your intervertebral discs. So here's a look at hyaline cartilage underneath the microscope, a light microscope at about 80 times magnified. We'll see the chondrocytes sitting out in those spaces called the lacuna. You see the nucleus of the chondrocyte, meaning it's alive. And again, we'll find hyaline cartilage lining the ends of bones so that when your bones touch at joints, they're not rubbing bone on bone. They have this layer of cartilage to help make a nice smooth kind of movement as you move your bones. Fibrocartilage has more collagen, and it's able to withstand compression and resist tearing and pulling. We'll find fibrocartilage in your discs between the vertebrae and in some of your joints like your knee and your temporomandibular, your jaw joint. And then the third type of cartilage is elastic cartilage. It contains elastic fibers. They appear as coiled fibers among bundles of collagen, and they are able to recoil and bend. So places that can recoil and bend in your body, like your external ear, your epiglottis, which is a little like flap-like structure, which covers up your trachea when you swallow food, so no food goes into your windpipe, as well as the auditory tube contain elastic cartilage. And those are the three types of cartilage. And here's a picture of the other two. So we showed you hyaline cartilage. Fibrocartilage has these nice collagen fibers. They make up places like in the intervertebral discs. And then elastic cartilage, you can see elastin fibers, and they will make up like your external ear because it can bend and come back, assuming its original shape. So that is fibrocartilage and elastic cartilage. Then we get to bone, which is a hard connective tissue. It consists of living cells. So your bone is a living active tissue with blood vessels, nerves, and a mineralized matrix, meaning it has minerals in its matrix, which gives it its strength. Osteocytes are the name of the mature bone cells located within the lacuna, again, which are just spaces within the matrix that hold those osteocytes. The strength and rigidity of the mineralized matrix will enable your bones to support and protect other tissues. So that's what makes bones hard. And there's two types of bones, spongy bone and compact bone. And we'll talk a lot more about bone when we get to your skeletal system in a couple chapters or the next chapter. Spongy bone has spaces between kind of bridges or trabeculae or plates of bone, and it looks like a sponge. And then compact bone is much more solid with almost no spaces between the many thin layers of mineralized matrix. So here we have a look underneath a microscope at about 240 times magnified. We're looking at compact bone. And if you look at this picture here, spongy bone kind of makes up more of the inside of the bone on the ends, and compact bone kind of makes up the edges of your bone itself. But in this compact bone, one section is called an osteon. It has a central canal where you'll have blood vessels and nerves going through it. You'll see these lacuna spaces where the osteocytes will hang out in. And again, the compact bone, it kind of makes up, the matrix is organized into what we call lamella, which are kind of rings or circles around the central canal. And I think in lab, I talked about it's much like taking, if you cut the trunk of a tree and look at a tree and kind of count the number of rings on the trunk to determine its age. That's kind of what an osteocyte or this osteon section of compact bone looks like. These rings of bone matrix are called lamella. Okay, now blood, kind of the complete opposite of bone, where bone was very hard connective tissue. Blood is a liquid connective tissue. It contains a liquid matrix. So again, the matrix is everything extracellular. And in bone, the matrix was made of minerals, which made it hard. But in blood, the liquid matrix, which is called your plasma, is more of a liquid, and the liquid matrix will have the formed elements in it. And the formed elements of blood will be all the cells, the erythrocytes, which are your red blood cells, the leukocytes, which are your white blood cells, which help in your immune system, and then your platelets, which help to form blood clots if you cut yourself accidentally. Blood functions in transporting food, oxygen, waste, hormones, and everything else. So blood is very important. So here we have blood, and we'll look at blood a lot, and we'll get into blood typing, cardiovascular system when we get to that chapter. But again, we're talking about blood as a type of connective tissue. So the structure are the formed elements, which are the cells in blood, and the fluid matrix, which is the plasma. So what that means is, when you take a blood sample, so let's say you are getting a blood test done, they just take out blood from your arm. And then what they'll do is they'll centrifuge or spin down the blood sample very quickly to separate out the red blood cells will float to the bottom. The plasma floats to the top, that's the liquid portion, and then in between are your white blood cells and platelets. But if we look at blood underneath the microscope, the majority of what you're seeing are red blood cells, which are these kind of biconcave shaped cells with no nucleus. Red blood cells are very cool cells because they have a specific structure that lends to its function. And here we have white blood cells, and underneath the microscope, the white blood cells will stain darker in color and they'll be larger. You have different types of white blood cells, 5 types, and each have a different function to fight off infection in the body. And then you'll see kind of platelets, which are pieces of big thrombocyte cells. And platelets help to form blood clots or to stop bleeding if you have some sort of blood vessel injury. And that is blood. Okay, then muscles. So we're into our third type of body tissue now. So epithelial tissue and connective tissue are really kind of they take up the bulk of this lecture. But muscle tissue, the main function of muscle tissue is to contract or shorten, which makes movement possible. So when muscle tissue contracts or shortens, it pulls on a part of the body to help move it or squeeze something through an organ, like an intestine, for example. Muscle contraction results from contractile proteins located within muscle cells. And you have 3 types of muscle tissue: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. And you should know these 3 types of muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle attaches to the skeleton to enable the body to move. So for example, your biceps brachii on the front side of your humerus helps you lift up your drink. So those are your skeletal muscles. They are striated, or it appears they have bands or stripes in them because of the arrangement of their contractile proteins within their muscle cells. So here we have a look at skeletal muscle. Underneath the microscope, skeletal muscle looks very, you can see the nice banded striations. The nucleus are pulled off to the periphery of those cells. And the skeletal muscle cells are arranged in really nice kind of parallel lines right on top of each other. Skeletal muscle is under voluntary control, meaning you guys know, you consciously control when you're moving parts of the body, and that's skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle is the muscle of the heart, and it is responsible for pumping blood when your heart contracts and ejects the blood out of the heart. Cardiac muscle cells are also cylindrical, but they're much shorter than our skeletal muscle cells. They're also striated, so they have those bands to them. They usually have 1 nucleus per cell, and they're often branched and connected to one another by gap junctions called intercalated discs. I mentioned how gap junctions are important in your heart to help your heart cells to contract as a unit. And those specific gap junctions between heart cells, cardiac cells, are intercalated discs. So you can see here, we still see striations in your cardiac muscle cells. We have the nuclei pushed off to the side, but we have branching occurring, kind of like a Y-shaped. So here we kind of have 1 cardiac muscle cell going up and 1 going down. So we kind of have this Y-shaped type branching. We also have these darker lines, the gap junctions called the intercalated discs in cardiac muscle cell. Your cardiac muscle pumps blood and it's under involuntary or unconscious control. So your cardiac muscle will contract subconsciously. You do not tell your heart to contract, which is good, so that when you're sleeping, your heart continues to beat and contract and pump your blood. And then the third type of smooth muscle tissue is smooth muscle. It forms the walls of your hollow organs. So your stomach, your intestines. It also is found in the skin and in your eyes. It's responsible for a number of functions like moving food through your digestive tract, emptying your bladder. Smooth muscle is found in the walls of the uterus, so it will contract to help get the baby out. And smooth muscles are what we call fusiform in shape, where they're really wide in the middle and then tapered or pointed at the end. They have a single nucleus and they're not striated, so they look nice and smooth. So here we have smooth muscle cells. So you can see right away there's no stripes, no striations. You'll find you'll find smooth muscle in the walls of your hollow organs, and smooth muscle is under unconscious or involuntary control. So this is why, smooth muscle is found in the walls of the uterus. The uterus will contract subconsciously, involuntarily, so that, you hear of women in comas still being able to give birth to a baby because the uterus is contracting and pushing it out. Obviously, what a woman says, to push or bear down is still very helpful to build up pressure behind the pushing, but the uterus itself is contracting and kind of squeezing that baby out. All right, and then we'll end with nervous tissue. So this is our fourth and final type of tissue, so we're almost done here. This will form the brain, your spinal cord, all of your nerves. It's responsible for coordinating and controlling your many body activities. Nervous tissue consists of the neuron, which is the name for a nerve cell, and all of the supporting cells called glial cells. The neuron is the nerve cell, and it's responsible for conducting action potentials, which just mean that nerve tissue is firing signals. That's what an action potential is. It's kind of a firing of a nerve cell. And the neuron is composed of three parts: a cell body, some dendrites, and an axon. So here's a look at a neuron, which is the nerve cell, and it consists of dendrites, which receive signals from other neurons, the cell body, which processes a signal it receives, and then it sends that signal on down this yellow axon. Surrounding the axon, we have these kind of little marshmallow-like structures, which are glial cells, which help to support that neuron. And we'll talk more about that when we get to nervous system as well. It's kind of hard to find a good neuron underneath a microscope, but this is a common picture that usually shows up when you Google neurons or nerve tissue cells. Okay, so tissue membranes are thin sheets of layers of tissue that covers a structure or lines a cavity. And most of these membranes consist of epithelial and connective tissue on which your epithelium rests. And you have four types of tissue membranes in the body. You can have a cutaneous membrane, a mucous membrane, a serous membrane, or a synovial membrane. And the skin itself is our cutaneous membrane. It's an external body surface membrane that covers everything that lies below it. A mucous membrane lines cavities that open to the outside of the body, like your digestive system, your respiratory system, and your reproductive tracts. And mucous membranes consist of epithelial cells, their basement membranes, and then connective tissue below them. Many, but not all, mucous membranes secrete mucus. And like we talked about mucus before, mucous membranes include protection. So you'll find a mucus layer in your stomach to help protect the walls of your stomach from the acidity of stomach digestive juices, so that in your stomach, it just helps your stomach walls from forming ulcers. And if you have a problem with secreting mucus in your stomach, you'll generally have ulcers in your stomach. Mucus helps with absorption as well as secretion in the membranes too. A serous membrane lines cavities that do not open to the exterior of the body. So your membrane that surrounds the heart, pericardial membrane, is a serous membrane. The membrane surrounding your lungs is a pleural membrane, and then the peritoneal cavity is lined with a serous membrane, and that surrounds your entire abdominal pelvic cavity. Serous membranes consist of simple squamous basement membrane and a delicate layer of smooth connective tissue. Serous membranes do not contain any glands, but they secrete a small amount of fluid called a serous fluid, which helps to lubricate or make nice and smooth just the surface of the membrane itself. And then a synovial membrane lines cavities of freely movable joints like your shoulder, your wrist, your elbow, your knee. They're made only up of connective tissue, and synovial membranes produce what we call synovial fluid, which makes your joints very slippery to reduce friction and allow a nice smooth movement between bones in that joint. So that's a synovial membrane. And this is just a look at all of the internal membranes or the internal coverings of the body. We didn't include cutaneous because cutaneous is the external covering of the skin of the body. So the mucous membranes, again, are lining structures that will empty into the external environment, like your respiratory, digestive, reproductive tracts. Serous membranes line internal body cavities that do not have contact with the external environment, like your pleural, your lung cavities, your peritoneal, your abdominal cavity, and then synovial membranes line cavities around your joints. Tissue inflammation. So now we'll talk about some of the disorders of your tissues that we've kind of covered, the different types of tissues, and we're almost done. You guys are doing a great job. This is a lot of material. Again, check out the announcement that I posted to help guide your studying for our first lecture exam, which will be on Monday. Inflammation is usually any process, usually a beneficial process occurring when a tissue is damaged. So anytime you swell up or get red, it's usually your body's way of trying to fight off whatever damage or infection that is occurring. So inflammation is usually a beneficial process. When, for example, a virus infects your epithelial cells of your upper respiratory tract, inflammation and the symptoms of the common cold are produced to try to get rid of that virus. The inflammatory process occurs in stages, which we'll go through. Inflammation, first of all, mobilizes your body's defenses. It isolates and destroys anything foreign, like microorganisms, other foreign materials, or any damaged cells, so that tissue repair can occur or start. And these are the the inflammation produces these 5 major symptoms: redness, heat, a fever, swelling, pain, and disturbance of function. And again, inflammation is generally a beneficial process because it's your body's way of trying to fight off or kill whatever has been damaged, has invaded your body cells, or is a different sort of microorganism. So let's talk about, let's say you get a splinter. The splinter is introduced into the skin. It breaks blood vessels. It introduces bacteria. So chemical mediators of inflammation are released to help the injured blood vessels. Some blood vessels will rupture, causing bleeding. Chemical mediators cause capillaries to dilate to bring more blood to that area, because traveling within the blood are platelets and white blood cells. So that's why the skin will become red, because blood vessels are dilating to bring more helpers found within the blood to that area. And while the blood cells leave the dilated blood vessels and move to the site of infection, they begin to phagocytize bacteria and other debris. So they eat up anything harmful that could be there. Tissue repair then, so once we start this inflammation process, we try to repair the tissue that has been cut or damaged. It involves substituting dead cells for viable cells. So it can occur by regeneration of cells or fibrosis, kind of forming a scar. In regeneration, new cells of the same type are replaced and function is restored. And in fibrosis, a new type of tissue will develop that eventually causes a scar production and the loss of some tissue function. Tissue repair then, regeneration itself can completely repair some tissues such as the skin and mucous membranes of your intestine. In these cases, regeneration is accomplished by stem cells, which are self-renewing. They're undifferentiated, so they can go on and can be any type of cell that can continue to divide throughout life. And tissue repair occurs in these sequential steps that are shown here. And I'll kind of end with this slide. Let's see if I can. So if we look here, kind of we have a fresh wound, kind of that's been, if you're accidentally cutting yourself when you're cutting up your vegetables, a blood clot will form to try to stop bleeding. From there, about 1 week after the injury, a scab will be present and the epithelium or new epidermis will be growing into the wound. And about 2 weeks after the injury, the epithelium has grown completely. Fibroblasts have formed a granular tissue to maybe form a scab. And then a freshly healed epidermis will form, where the granular tissue will become replaced with new connective tissue. This happens, 1 month after initial repair, but as you all know with kids, kids heal a lot more quickly than adults do. So this whole process might be just sped up to happen in a couple of weeks. And that's the end of chapter 4. So I'll go ahead and stop the recording, and then I'll answer any questions for those of you who are